I sat in the silence of my fortified penthouse, gripping a mug of black coffee, my eyes locked on the glowing monitors covering my glass desk. On the high-definition feed, my father, Vernon, drove a steel crowbar into the mahogany front door of my former apartment, splintering the deadbolt with a sickening crack. My mother, Loretta, stepped right over the ruined wood, immediately uncorking a bottle of my reserve wine. Close behind them, my younger brother Wyatt strutted inside, ushering a syndicate of intimidating tech investors into the living room. They thought I was currently 30,000 feet in the air on a flight to London. They believed they could shatter my locks, hijack my luxury space, and host a fraudulent corporate gala using my assets to secure millions of dollars for Wyatt's fake startup. They had absolutely no idea I evacuated 3 weeks ago. They did not realize the flashing server sitting in the center of the office was a federal cybersecurity honeypot. On the screen, Wyatt smirked, plugging a silver flash drive directly into my decoy network. I set my coffee down and tapped the enter key. Heavy steel security shutters slammed over the floor-to-ceiling windows, permanently sealing the exits and trapping them inside for the tactical breach. Before I reveal exactly how my entitled family walked blindly into a federal cage, drop your city in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe if you love seeing arrogant trespassers face ultimate justice. The true catalyst occurred 3 weeks prior to the lockdown. On a Friday evening in the fall of 2010, I stepped out of the elevator and walked down the quiet, carpeted corridor of my building. I had just completed a grueling 60-hour security audit for an international financial institution. My muscles physically ached, and my vision blurred slightly from staring at cascading lines of code, hunting for microscopic vulnerabilities in their server architecture. I wanted nothing more than a hot shower and absolute silence. I slid my key into the heavy brass lock of my mahogany front door. The cylinder turned with its usual solid click. I pushed the door open, reached for the light switch, and stopped dead on the threshold. My pristine sanctuary was shattered. A violent trail of dried, caked mud tracked directly across the cream fibers of my Persian rug. I dropped my briefcase. It hit the hardwood floor with a heavy thud. I stepped inside, my pulse accelerating into a rapid, mechanical rhythm. I scanned the living room. Expensive decorative cushions lay scattered across the floor, discarded like garbage. The glass doors of my custom liquor cabinet hung wide open, the hinges strained. 3 bottles of reserve bourbon were missing, leaving prominent circular dust rings on the polished dark wood. A discarded tumbler sat on the coffee table, a small puddle of amber liquid staining a stack of design magazines. I moved down the hallway, my footsteps silent against the wood. I pushed open the door to my home office. The space served as my command center, a fortress of digital security and quiet order. Now, it looked like a ransacked storage unit. The top drawers of my steel filing cabinets hung ajar, the metal locks visibly warped and scratched by a flathead screwdriver. They had rifled through my printed financial ledgers and tossed discarded tax documents across my glass desk. But my eyes bypassed the scattered paperwork. They locked onto the empty space resting above the bookshelves. The velvet-lined display case was open. My grandmother's antique violin was gone. The instrument was a priceless family heirloom. It carried the physical memory of the only relative who ever showed me genuine affection. The woman who funded my first computer and encouraged my intellect when my parents dismissed it. The empty velvet indentation hit me with the force of a physical blow. I backed out of the office and walked directly into the kitchen. Resting perfectly centered on the white marble island was a piece of torn notebook paper. I picked it up. The handwriting consisted of the loopy, hurried cursive I recognized instantly. It belonged to Loretta. The ink detailed a casual, breathtakingly entitled message. She claimed they had borrowed the instrument to pawn it. She wrote that Wyatt needed urgent seed money to secure server space for his new tech startup. The ink spelled out a masterclass in manipulation, stating that since I never played the dusty old thing anyway, I should be thrilled to help my younger brother build his future. She ended the note with a flippant reminder to buy more bourbon because they had run dry celebrating his upcoming launch. I set the paper down on the marble surface. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out my keychain, staring at the metal rings. The exact methodology of their invasion crystallized in my mind. 5 years ago, I gave Vernon an emergency spare key after a severe winter storm knocked out the city's power grid. I provided it for absolute, life-threatening emergencies. They retained it, quietly placing it on their key rack, and weaponized my past trust to fund my brother's narcissistic delusions. A normal person would have grabbed their phone immediately. They would have dialed their parents, screaming into the receiver, demanding the rapid return of their property. They would have collapsed onto the kitchen floor, weeping over the violation of their safe space. I did not shed a single tear. I did not scream. I stood perfectly still in the center of the violated kitchen. I closed my eyes. The remaining frayed threads of my familial loyalty snapped, dissolving completely into the cold air of the apartment. I had spent my entire adult life building a quiet, lucrative existence, maintaining a polite, distant boundary to avoid their constant demands for financial handouts. I played the role of the solitary, unremarkable daughter to keep the peace. That peace was officially terminated. They viewed my success as a communal asset. They looked at my apartment and saw a hardware store they could loot whenever Wyatt mismanaged his finances. They thought I was a passive corporate drone who would swallow the theft and write it off as an obligatory family tax. They failed to comprehend the fundamental nature of my profession. A cybersecurity architect does not rely on emotion. I analyze threats. I build impenetrable digital fortresses. I isolate malware. And I permanently neutralize the adversaries who attempt to breach my perimeter. I open my eyes. The initial shock evaporated, leaving behind a glacial, terrifying clarity. I did not sit at my desk, nor did I reach for my keyboard. Not yet. In digital warfare, the first rule of engagement is to establish the baseline of your adversary. I needed to see their faces, to document their unearned confidence before I dismantled it. I stepped back from the office, leaving the ransacked room in darkness. The time for silent endurance was over. Absolute war was coming, and the audit would begin tomorrow morning in the suburbs. The morning sun offered zero warmth as I drove my sedan through the winding, manicured streets of the suburban development. Frost clung to the dormant lawns, crunching under the tires. I parked against the curb outside my parents' residence. The structure loomed at the end of the cul-de-sac, a sprawling, two-story colonial built in the late 1990s. From the street, it projected affluence. Up close, the facade crumbled. Paint peeled along the window trims in long, dry flakes. Weeds fractured the concrete driveway. A luxury sports utility vehicle sat near the garage doors, bearing a fresh dealership lease frame. Vernon and Loretta orchestrated their entire existence around projecting a wealthy status they fundamentally lacked, funding their illusion through a mountain of crushing debt. I did not knock. I turned the brass knob and pushed the heavy oak door inward. The deadbolt remained unengaged, a stark contrast to the shattered lock they left at my home the night before. The thick, suffocating aroma of melting butter and brewing espresso saturated the foyer. The sound of clattering pans and heavy keystrokes echoed down the hall. I walked across the faux marble tiles, my boots silent, and stopped in the arched entryway of the kitchen. The room served as the primary theater for their daily delusions. Vernon sat at the head of the long dining table. He wore a pressed Oxford shirt, snapping the broad pages of a financial newspaper sharply to crease the spine. Loretta hovered over the 6-burner stove. She drove a wire whisk hard against the inside of a stainless steel bowl, the metal-on-metal grating piercing the quiet morning. Wyatt occupied the center island. He hunched over a sleek silver laptop, striking the keys with a theatrical, heavy force designed to command attention. He wore a designer cashmere sweater, a garment undoubtedly purchased using the cash extracted from my liquor cabinet or my stolen heirlooms. I leaned my shoulder against the doorframe. "You broke the deadbolt," I stated. I kept my vocal cords relaxed, stripping all inflection and emotion from the syllables. Loretta paused her whisking. She tapped the tool against the rim of the bowl, producing a sharp, ringing chime. She turned, wiping her hands down the front of a linen apron. A practiced, condescending smile stretched across her face, pulling the skin tight around her eyes. "Jade, you finished your little work project early." She completely bypassed the accusation, pouring a smooth circle of batter onto the sizzling griddle. The dough hissed instantly. "We did not break anything. The lock jammed. Your father merely applied the necessary physical pressure to get inside." "You took the violin," I said, maintaining the exact same volume. Loretta released a dramatic, weary sigh. She flipped the pancake, projecting the exhausted patience of a martyr negotiating with a petulant child. "Took is such an ugly, accusatory word. Jade. We borrowed it. We are a family. Family shares resources." She gestured toward me with the spatula. "You live such a selfish, solitary lifestyle in that massive, sterile apartment. You hoard things you do not even use. You bury yourself in computer code and ignore the people who love you. When did you last open that display case?" Wyatt faced a critical juncture. He needed the capital. Vernon lowered his newspaper. He removed his reading glasses, letting them hang from the woven cord resting around his neck. He picked up his ceramic coffee mug, taking a slow, deliberate sip. "Your mother speaks the truth," Vernon declared, his deep baritone reverberating across the granite countertops. "You act as if we invaded a sovereign nation. We brought you into this world. We funded your braces. We placed a roof over your head for 18 years. A family operates as a single entity. The assets of one member serve the survival of the whole. You hold a piece of property in your name, but the foundation of that property was poured by us, by all rights. That apartment serves as an extension of this family's territory. We required access. You were ignoring your phone." I audited their statements. I registered the deflection. I documented the specific vocabulary of narcissistic ownership. They possessed absolutely no concept of my autonomy. In my profession, when a firewall is breached, you do not ask the malware to apologize. You quarantine the infected nodes and initiate a purge. At the island, Wyatt ceased his typing. He slammed the laptop screen down 3 inches, projecting extreme irritation at the interruption. He spun his bar stool around, crossing his arms over his chest. He looked me up and down, his lips curling into a distinctive sneer. It is just carved wood and dried string. Jade." Wyatt scoffed. He jabbed a thumb over his shoulder toward the glowing computer screen. "I am disrupting the entire data aggregation market. My neural network algorithms are synergizing cloud architectures. Do you even comprehend the market capitalization on this software? I have a syndicate of venture capitalists ready to write massive checks." He reached across the island, picking up a strip of bacon and taking a loud bite. "Once my company goes public next quarter, I will buy you a dozen antique violins. I will buy you a whole symphony." He let out a short, arrogant laugh, shaking his head. "You spend your days punching a clock for a commercial bank. You secure firewalls to protect someone else's wealth. You are a digital janitor, sweeping up bugs for the real players. You lack vision. Stop crying over a dusty instrument and look at the bigger picture." I absorbed the barrage. I did not clench my jaw. I did not cross my arms. I forced my respiratory rate to remain slow and steady, inhaling through my nose and exhaling through my mouth. I allowed my facial muscles to completely relax into a blank, unreadable mask. I observed them not as my mother, father, and brother, but as active, hostile threats operating within my perimeter. They mocked my corporate position. Entirely ignorant of the lethal digital power I yielded, they believed I was a passive victim, a minor obstacle easily steamrolled by their collective entitlement. I looked at Loretta, holding her metal spatula. I looked at Vernon, gripping his ceramic mug. I looked at Wyatt, chewing his food with his chest puffed out in unearned triumph. "I understand," I said softly. I offered a slow, deliberate nod. "Family legacy is important." I turned on my heel. I walked down the hallway, traversed the faux marble foyer, and pulled the heavy oak door firmly shut behind me. I walked down the cracked concrete driveway toward my sedan. The cold morning air filled my lungs. The fragile, compliant daughter they expected to manipulate died inside that kitchen. The auditor had arrived. I drove back to the city center, the skyline reflecting off my windshield in sharp, jagged lines. I bypassed the building's concierge, swiped my security fob, and rode the elevator to my floor. I inserted my key, pushed open the shattered remains of my front door, and ignored the dried mud staining the Persian rug. I walked directly into my home office. I pulled the heavy blackout curtains shut, plunging the room into deep shadows. I dropped into my ergonomic chair and tapped the spacebar. The dual monitors flared to life, casting a pale, clinical blue light across the glass surface of my desk. Wyatt bragged about disrupting markets. He boasted about neural networks and cloud synergies at the kitchen island. But arrogant men inevitably leave massive, reckless digital footprints. I cracked my knuckles, resting my hands over the mechanical keyboard. I launched my encrypted terminal. I typed a rapid sequence of commands, initiating a covert back-channel registry sweep. I needed the foundational architecture of his supposed empire. I accessed state corporate filings, isolating the primary domain tied to his entity. Wyatt purchased his server space from a discount commercial host. He shielded his network with a basic, off-the-shelf firewall. It constituted the digital equivalent of a brittle twig holding a steel gate closed. I did not force the gate. I searched for a side window. I deployed a packet sniffer, a specialized diagnostic tool, to capture the data packets traveling between his server and the public web. The data streamed down my left monitor in endless, cascading lines of green text. I scrutinized the traffic patterns. Wyatt failed to implement two-factor authentication for his administrative access. He routed his logins through unsecured channels. I compiled a brute force decryption script, feeding it variations of his birth date, his college fraternity, and his middle name. The terminal hummed, cycling through thousands of cryptographic permutations per second. I leaned back, sipping a glass of lukewarm water, watching the progress bar crawl across the screen. Exactly 2 hours and 41 minutes later, the terminal emitted a sharp, satisfying click. The command prompt flipped from denied to granted. I crossed the threshold into his internal network. No alarms triggered, no defensive countermeasures deployed. I achieved complete root access. I navigated the root directories. I searched for his vaunted product. I scanned for code repositories, machine learning models, or proprietary algorithms. The queries returned 0 results. I dug into the hidden subdirectories. I found nothing but plagiarized open-source scripts and empty placeholder files. Wyatt manufactured absolute vaporware. He possessed no software. I shifted my crosshairs to the financial infrastructure. I located the master accounting databases. I bypassed the superficial read-only locks and initiated a bulk extraction protocol. The files funneled through my secure proxy, compiling onto my isolated ghost server. I opened the spreadsheets. Columns of raw financial data flooded the monitors. I executed a sorting algorithm to categorize the incoming capital. Millions of dollars in venture capital flowed into a primary operating account. I tracked the outgoing disbursements. A legitimate startup allocates capital toward payroll, server maintenance, and research. Wyatt routed $0 toward development. Instead, the money bled outward through a convoluted maze of transfers. He funneled the investor capital into 3 distinct shell corporations registered in Delaware. From those domestic shells, he initiated continuous international wire transfers, pushing the funds into offshore holding accounts in the Caymans and the British Virgin Islands. Wyatt operated a textbook Ponzi scheme, laundering the capital to mask the theft. I traced the debit routing numbers attached to the offshore nodes. The bank statements painted a masterpiece of sheer financial treason. I matched the routing hashes to vendor profiles. Wyatt siphoned the venture capital to fund an obscene lifestyle. The ledger detailed massive outgoing wires to luxury car dealerships, securing leases for imported sports cars. I found repeating high 5-figure charges mapped to exclusive nightlife venues, VIP bottle service, and private yacht charters. The bespoke cashmere sweater he wore at the kitchen island matched a recent debit from a high-end European tailor. He transformed the trust of his investors into a personal, limitless slush fund. He lived like a billionaire on stolen equity. I scrutinized the most recent transaction logs, hunting for the specific anomaly that triggered the break-in. The pattern of reckless spending halted abruptly 14 days ago. A glaring red deficit materialized in the margin ledger. Wyatt grew greedy. He leveraged the remaining stolen capital on high-risk derivatives, betting heavily on volatile tech stocks. The market shifted against him. A prominent brokerage firm issued a severe margin call. The deficit demanded immediate liquidity. He faced automatic liquidation and total exposure if he failed to produce the cash. I traced the timestamps. The brokerage issued the final warning exactly 48 hours before Vernon drove a crowbar through my door lock. The narrative clicked into perfect, devastating focus. They did not steal my violin to fund a visionary launch. They did not need seed money to secure server space. My parents pawned my irreplaceable heirloom to plug a gaping, bleeding hole in a sinking, criminal ship. They destroyed my sanctuary to keep Wyatt out of a federal penitentiary. I extracted the offshore routing nodes. I isolated the wire transfer hashes, capturing the undeniable digital fingerprints of every single embezzled dollar. I cross-referenced the fake Delaware shell companies with the corresponding Caymans accounts. I compiled the evidence into a master directory. I organized the data into chronological folders, building a clear, irrefutable timeline of wire fraud, grand larceny, and corporate embezzlement. I ran a heavy encryption protocol over the directory, locking the data behind a military-grade cipher. I exported the completed dossier onto a secure, ruggedized flash drive. The transfer progress bar hit 100%. The screen displayed a successful copy prompt. I safely ejected the drive. I pulled the device from the port. The cold metal rested heavy in my palm. The rage inside my chest crystallized into absolute, lethal calm. Wyatt thought he controlled the board. He thought he could steal from me without consequence. I closed my hand around the drive. I now held the ammunition required to completely obliterate his existence. I kept the encrypted flash drive resting on the glass surface of my desk. The primary financial extraction concluded, but my intrusion protocol remained active, silently siphoning the residual data packets flowing through Wyatt's compromised network. To orchestrate a fraud of this magnitude, an embezzler requires a continuous exchange of information. He required accomplices. I deployed a specialized scraping script, directing it to penetrate the administrative layer of his email server. The terminal blinked, aggregating hundreds of messages into a raw text file. I applied a targeted search filter, isolating correspondences containing Vernon and Loretta's specific email addresses. The query rapidly sifted through the digital noise, returning a dense cluster of threads originating over the past 48 hours. The subject line of the most recent, highly active exchange read simply, "Capital Injection Logistics." I click the file. The plain text loaded onto the stark black background of my right monitor, the bright green font illuminating the dark room. I scrutinized the timestamps. The digital conversation initiated shortly after I departed their suburban kitchen that very morning, while the engine of my sedan was still cooling in my parking garage. Wyatt opened the thread with a frantic, disorganized status report. The pawned violin covered the immediate margin deficit, suppressing the immediate threat of liquidation, but his overarching financial hemorrhage demanded a massive, sustained influx of cash. The stolen heirloom merely bought him a handful of days. He detailed a critical upcoming meeting scheduled for the following Saturday evening. He sought to pitch his fabricated software company to a syndicate of aggressive, high-tier venture capitalists. I recognized the investment firm he named in the text. They operated with ruthless, unforgiving efficiency. They maintained a reputation across the financial sector for dismantling and liquidating founders who failed to deliver projected returns. These men did not fund college dropouts operating out of cluttered suburban basements. They demanded proof of personal success. They required physical evidence of extreme wealth, operating under the assumption that a founder possessing significant personal capital presented a significantly lower investment risk. Wyatt explicitly stated his dilemma, his keystrokes conveying raw panic. He possessed a leased luxury sports car, he owned bespoke designer sweaters, he frequented exclusive nightlife venues. However, he lacked the requisite high-end real estate to project the definitive image of a prodigy tech titan. He needed a stage. He needed a sprawling, luxury backdrop to host a lavish investor gala, complete with top-tier network architecture to simulate his vaporware demonstration. He begged his parents for a solution, warning them that the syndicate would walk away if he appeared desperate. I scrolled down, accessing Vernon's response. My father did not counsel caution. He did not suggest renting a temporary corporate boardroom or a luxury hotel suite. He offered up my entire existence. Vernon reminded Wyatt of my upcoming travel itinerary. I maintained a strict, highly predictable corporate schedule, a fact they monitored closely. Months ago, during a rare, obligatory family dinner, I mentioned my selection as a keynote speaker for an upcoming international cybersecurity conference. I booked a direct flight to London for Friday, October 16th. I planned to remain overseas for 4 days. Vernon outlined the invasion strategy with chilling, logistical precision. He proposed bypassing the building concierge by utilizing the freight elevator access codes I provided to them years ago to assist with furniture deliveries. He instructed Loretta to procure a heavy-duty locksmith tool to force the deadbolt, entirely dismissing my morning confrontation as a minor, insignificant hurdle. He wrote that my apartment constituted family territory, asserting that my impending absence practically served as an invitation to utilize the space. Loretta chimed into the digital exchange, her contribution vibrating with a terrifying, sociopathic enthusiasm. She drafted a meticulous itinerary for the break-in. They planned to infiltrate my apartment early Saturday afternoon. She volunteered to sweep the space, outlining her intention to aggressively stow my personal effects inside closet bins. She detailed her plan to replace my framed photographs with framed press clippings and images of Wyatt, effectively erasing my identity from my own home. Her emails transitioned from logistics to catering. She detailed the menu for the venture capitalists, explicitly noting her plan to raid my climate-controlled wine cellar. She listed the specific vintages of my reserve Bordeaux she intended to uncork, plotting to serve my most expensive bottles to lubricate the investors' wallets. She discussed rearranging my modern furniture to create a more open floor plan for the networking event, treating my carefully curated sanctuary like a rented banquet hall. Wyatt finalized the operational plan. He coveted my custom server racks and my massive dual monitors. He intended to power up my hardware, routing his silver flash drive through my high-speed network architecture. He planned to project his fake datasets onto my screens, utilizing my professional setup to validate his fraudulent algorithms. They intended to completely hijack my life, rebranding my sanctuary, my assets, and my technological infrastructure as the undisputed spoils of Wyatt's imaginary genius. I reached the bottom of the email thread. The final message ended with Wyatt thanking them, declaring they were the only people who truly believed in his vision. I removed my hands from the keyboard. I let my arms rest on the armrests of my chair. The low, mechanical hum of the server towers filled the quiet office, a stark contrast to the deafening betrayal echoing from the screen. The sheer, unadulterated sociopathy of their conspiracy staggered the mind. Normal individuals, upon facing financial ruin, might beg a relative for a loan. They might swallow their pride and declare corporate bankruptcy. My family opted for synchronized, premeditated home invasion, grand larceny, and complete identity theft. They viewed my life not as a separate, autonomous reality, but as a costume wardrobe they could rifle through, trying on my accomplishments whenever their own failures became too cold to bear. A standard reaction dictated immediate, defensive measures. A civilian would contact the building management, demanding an immediate revocation of all freight elevator codes. They would hire a premium security firm to install biometric deadbolts and reinforced steel frames. They would forward the printed email chain to the local precinct, demanding a permanent restraining order to block their family from stepping within 100 yards of the premises. I stared at the glowing green text on the monitor. I did not reach for my smartphone. I did not contact building security. I did not draft a warning message. The corners of my mouth twitched upward, slowly settling into a cold, sustained smile. In the realm of advanced digital warfare, preventing an attack merely preserves the status quo. It pushes the adversary back into the shadows, leaving them free to regroup and strike again from a different angle, allowing an attack to proceed, while secretly controlling the entire battlefield, guarantees the absolute, permanent annihilation of the threat. They drafted a meticulous roadmap detailing exactly when, where, and how they planned to commit multiple severe felonies. They selected the venue. They orchestrated the timeline. They invited the necessary witnesses. When adversaries construct a heavy timber guillotine, sharpen the steel blade, and voluntarily position their own necks directly across the block, you do not interrupt their labor. You do not change the locks to keep them out. You leave the door wide open. You step back into the shadows. You simply prepare to pull the lever. I commenced the extraction protocol before the sun breached the city skyline. I opened a secure, encrypted channel to my asset management attorney. I authorized the immediate creation of an anonymous blind trust, shielding my identity behind layers of corporate holding companies. I wired $1,200,000 in liquid capital to an escrow account. By noon, I possessed the digital deeds to a heavily fortified penthouse located across the river, entirely isolated from the district my family frequented. The new structure prioritized defense over aesthetics. Access required biometric retina scans. Reinforced steel doors guarded the private elevators. Subterranean parking eliminated street-level exposure. I secured my new sanctuary in total silence. A conventional relocation requires loud trucks, sweating laborers, and chaotic cardboard boxes cluttering the hallways. A conventional relocation attracts attention. I required absolute invisibility. I leased a nondescript, unmarked cargo van using a corporate proxy account. I parked the vehicle in the subterranean loading dock of my building. I operated exclusively within the dead zone, maximizing my efforts between the hours of 2 o'clock and 5 o'clock in the morning, when the city slept and the building staff rotated shifts. I dismantled my reality piece by piece. I disconnected my primary server racks, unspooling miles of fiber optic cables. I hoisted the heavy steel chassis onto a rubber-wheeled hand truck. I braced the weight against my shoulders, navigating the freight elevator with calculated precision. My muscles burned. Sweat stung my eyes. I pushed through the physical exhaustion, fueled by the cold adrenaline of impending retribution. I boxed my irreplaceable items. I packed original property deeds, encrypted hard drives, and the remaining heirlooms Loretta failed to plunder. I transported the heavy plastic crates down to the concrete loading dock, stacking them inside the cargo van. I drove the route to the new penthouse, unloaded the cargo into the secure vault, and drove back before the morning traffic materialized. I repeated this grueling circuit for 10 consecutive nights. I dissolved my presence, erasing the core of my existence from the space. Removing my authentic assets solved only half the equation. An empty apartment triggers questions. A hollow space invites suspicion. I needed to construct a flawless illusion. I needed a decoy. During my lunch breaks at the financial institution, I accessed wholesale furniture liquidation networks. I cross-referenced the dimensions of my actual furniture. I ordered cheap, mass-produced replicas. I swapped my authentic Italian leather sofa for a stiff polyurethane knockoff. I replaced my heavy oak dining table with hollow particle board. I switched my high-end memory foam mattress with a cheap spring coil derivative. The visual footprint remained identical to the untrained eye, but the intrinsic value evaporated. I purged my closet. I transported my tailored suits, silk blouses, and expensive footwear to the secure penthouse. I left behind outdated sweaters, worn denim, and scuffed shoes, arranging the garments on the wooden hangers to simulate a fully occupied wardrobe. I stocked the refrigerator with expiring dairy and cheap produce. I placed half-empty water glasses on the bedside tables. I draped a discarded throw blanket over the arm of the replica sofa. I engineered the detritus of a lived-in space. The physical illusion required a digital heartbeat. A dark apartment broadcasts vacancy. I wrote a localized automation script, hardwiring it directly into the apartment's smart home hub. I synchronized the smart bulbs to mimic my established routine. The kitchen lights flared to life at exactly 6 o'clock in the morning. The bathroom illumination engaged 10 minutes later. The living room lamps glowed dimly throughout the evening, cutting to black precisely at 11 o'clock at night. I programmed the thermostat to cycle the climate control system, creating the ambient mechanical noise of an occupied dwelling. I synced a pair of hidden Bluetooth speakers to play faint, muffled television audio during primetime hours. I monitored the perimeter. I installed microscopic, motion-activated lenses inside the brickwork facing the street. On the Thursday evening of the relocation phase, the surveillance system pinged my encrypted smartphone. I accessed the live feed from the safety of my new penthouse. Vernon's leased sports utility vehicle idled at the curb across from my old building. The streetlights illuminated the interior cabin. Vernon gripped the steering wheel, peering upward through the windshield. Loretta sat in the passenger seat, pointing a manicured finger toward the 7th floor. They stared at the warm, yellow light spilling from the windows of my apartment. They watched the shadows shift against the blind shadows generated by rotating smart bulbs I programmed 2 days prior. I zoomed the camera lens, capturing the satisfied, arrogant smiles spreading across their faces. They pointed at the moving shadows, exchanging enthusiastic nods. They believed I sat inside, oblivious, sipping tea on my couch. They believed my sanctuary awaited their impending invasion. Vernon shifted the vehicle into drive. They pulled away from the curb, the taillights fading into the dense city traffic. I terminated the video feed. I stood in the center of my new, impenetrable fortress. My authentic servers hummed quietly in the corner, processing terabytes of secure data. My genuine assets rested securely inside biometric safes. I had successfully stripped away every single vulnerability. I had extracted the marrow of my existence, leaving behind a hollow, weaponized shell. I poured a glass of ice water and stared out over the illuminated skyline. I controlled the battlefield. The stage was perfectly set. The bait hung securely on the hook. I returned to the hollowed-out apartment on a Tuesday night to construct the digital snare. The physical illusion of the replica furniture provided the camouflage. Now, I required the bait. I transported a decommissioned, commercial-grade server tower into the vacant home office. The steel chassis weighed 80 pounds. I hoisted it onto the replica glass desk, centering the hardware prominently in the room. I oriented the cooling fans to face the doorway, ensuring the machine served as the immediate focal point for anyone entering the space. I routed thick bundles of Ethernet cables along the baseboards, anchoring the black cords with heavy-duty steel staples. The setup projected the undeniable aesthetic of a permanent, high-capacity corporate workstation. Wyatt demanded a stage to impress his venture capitalists. I built him an altar. I booted the decoy terminal. The dual cooling fans whirred to life, filling the quiet room with a low, steady mechanical hum. I opened my code editor. Wyatt promised his investors a live, functional demonstration of a proprietary algorithm. I needed to feed his arrogance. I spent 6 hours writing a labyrinth of simulated data. I generated thousands of files containing dummy variables, cascading loops, and complex mathematical models. I structured the directories using dense corporate jargon, labeling the folders with titles like predictive market synergy, neural aggregation protocols, and cloud architecture models. To an experienced cybersecurity professional, the code constituted absolute gibberish. However, to a desperate, failed entrepreneur attempting to con a room full of aggressive financiers, the directories represented a billion-dollar software breakthrough. The simulated data pulsed on the screen, an irresistible mirage of unearned wealth. The fake files functioned merely as the superficial wrapper. I embedded the true payload deep within the root directory of the operating system. I coded a highly aggressive, self-executing malware script, tethering the command prompt directly to the server's universal serial bus ports. I configured the parameters to operate with absolute zero tolerance. The millisecond and external flash drive interfaced with the hardware. The malware would breach the foreign device. It would slice through standard commercial encryption, scrape the raw contents of the drive, and instantly copy the data packets. I did not route the outgoing transmission to my own encrypted network. Confiscating his offshore ledgers privately would constitute vigilantism, leaving me burdened with the responsibility of proving his crimes. I required a larger, more definitive hammer. I routed the exfiltration node directly to the automated threat reporting portal of the Federal Bureau of Investigation Cybercrimes Division. I disguised the outgoing ping as a Level 1 corporate intrusion alert. I formatted the data packets to match the exact protocol standards demanded by federal cyber analysts when Wyatt plugged his silver drive into my machine. He would not just initiate a fake software demonstration. He would actively hurl his hidden offshore ledgers, his fake shell company routing numbers, and his undeniable embezzlement tracks directly into the lap of federal law enforcement. A digital trap requires a physical cage. I abandoned the keyboard and retrieved my heavy canvas toolbox. The property developers of my building originally installed high-end security amenities for severe weather protection and urban lockdown scenarios. Heavy steel storm shutters lay coiled within the window frames, and solid-core mahogany doors housed internal electronic deadbolts. The property management controlled these countermeasures via a centralized, wall-mounted interface panel in the hallway. I unscrewed the plastic faceplate of the control panel, exposing a dense tangle of copper wiring and green circuit boards. I ignited my soldering iron, letting the metal tip heat until it glowed a dull orange. I severed the physical connection linking the apartment to the building's primary mainframe. I stripped the plastic casings from the copper wires, exposed the raw fibers, and spliced them directly into a custom microcontroller. I fused the connections with drops of molten solder, the sharp smell of ozone filling the corridor. I synchronized the microcontroller to a localized wireless network, broadcasting the signal exclusively to a heavily encrypted channel on my secure laptop. I established a master override switch. A single keystroke on my remote terminal would instantly sever the power relays, deploy the steel shutters, and disengage the internal door mechanisms, permanently sealing the perimeter. I executed a localized diagnostic test. I stood in the center of the living room and pressed the spacebar on my laptop. The response proved immediate and violent. The heavy steel storm shutters slammed downward over the floor-to-ceiling windows with a concussive, deafening crack. The metal barriers eclipsed the illuminated city skyline, plunging the apartment into absolute, suffocating darkness. The electronic deadbolts fired simultaneously, the heavy steel rods sliding into the reinforced door frames with sharp, definitive clicks. The ambient airflow ceased. The apartment transformed instantly from a luxury open-concept loft into a sealed concrete vault. I pressed the spacebar a second time. The gears engaged, pulling the heavy metal shutters back into the ceiling and retracting the deadbolts. The skyline reappeared. The physical cage functioned flawlessly. I required uninterrupted 360 degrees of visibility to monitor the execution. I dragged an aluminum stepladder across the hardwood floors. I removed the galvanized steel grates covering the overhead heating, ventilation, and air conditioning ducts. I mounted microscopic, high-definition camera lenses deep within the metal shafts, angling them to capture the entryway, the living room seating area, and the office desk. I positioned additional lenses behind the perforated plastic shells of the smoke detectors. I nestled a final, wide-angle lens within the dark crevices of a hollowed-out book spine on the office shelf. I routed the raw video feeds through a secure, off-site proxy server. I channeled the high-resolution streams directly to the massive monitors sitting on the glass desk in my new penthouse. I tested the audio receptors, confirming the microphones picked up the faintest sound of a pin dropping against the floorboards. I controlled the sight, the sound, and the physical architecture of the space. I descended the ladder and collapsed it. I stood in the center of the living room, conducting a final visual sweep of the environment. The cheap, Polyurethane replica sofa sat perfectly angled around the hollow coffee table. The automated lighting schedule engaged, casting a warm, inviting yellow glow from the floor lamps. The decoy server hummed quietly in the adjacent office, its blue indicator lights pulsing rhythmically against the dark walls. The space projected the warmth, affluence, and security of an elite corporate architect. It masked the lethal reality hiding just beneath the drywall and within the lines of code. I had stripped away my sanctuary and replaced it with a weaponized, federal steel trap, perfectly calibrated, entirely invisible, and waiting patiently for its prey. Friday, October 16th, 2010, arrived with a heavy overcast sky. The city groaned under the weight of early morning traffic. It constituted the exact date of my scheduled departure for the International Cybersecurity Conference. I required a flawless performance to trigger the final phase of the operation. The execution demanded theatrical precision. I stood on the sidewalk outside a busy commercial transit hub, 2 miles away from my actual penthouse. The frigid autumn wind whipped my wool coat around my knees. I gripped the telescopic handle of a hollow, rolling suitcase, the prop served exclusively to validate my physical silhouette in public. I raised my arm, signaling a passing yellow taxi. The vehicle swerved against the curb, the tires scraping the concrete. I threw the empty suitcase into the trunk, pulled open the rear door, and slid onto the cracked vinyl seat. "Circle the financial district," I instructed the driver. "Keep the meter running." The cab merged back into the chaotic gridlock. Horns blared, sirens wailed in the distance. The abrasive, overwhelming ambient noise of the urban morning provided the perfect acoustic camouflage. I pulled my encrypted smartphone from my pocket and dialed Loretta. The line rang twice before she answered. "Jade," Loretta chimed. Her pitch sat half an octave higher than her baseline. The syllables rushed together, betraying a frantic, barely contained energy. "Are you at the terminal? Did you make it through the check-in counter?" I pinched the bridge of my nose, injecting a heavy dose of manufactured exasperation into my vocal cords. "I am sitting in deadlocked traffic on the expressway," I complained, raising my volume to compete with the blaring horn of a neighboring delivery truck. "The perimeter congestion stretches for 3 miles. The airline application indicates the security queues extend past the terminal doors. I will barely make the boarding call." "Oh, you poor thing," Loretta cooed. The sympathy possessed the depth of a shallow puddle. The fabricated concern masked a profound, predatory eagerness. "You just focus on getting to your gate. Do not worry about a single thing back here. We have everything completely under control." "I am powering down my devices the moment I step onto the jet bridge," I stated, establishing the critical operational parameter. "My phone remains offline for the next 14 hours while I cross the Atlantic. The conference organizers arranged a direct transport from Heathrow. I will not have signal until tomorrow morning." "Understood," Loretta replied. The sharp, satisfied smile radiating through the cellular connection felt practically physical. "Have a wonderful, productive trip, sweetheart. Turn off that screen and get some rest. We love you." "Goodbye, Loretta," I said. I terminated the call. I powered down the device, extracted the subscriber identity module card, and snapped the plastic chip in half. I dropped the fragmented pieces into a disposable coffee cup resting in the cab's cup holder. I severed the final tether linking my old life to their ongoing conspiracy. "Pull over at the next corner," I commanded the driver. I handed him a crisp bill, retrieved my empty suitcase, and stepped out onto the bustling pavement. I walked half a block, turned down a narrow, shadowed alleyway, and stopped. A heavily tinted black sports utility vehicle idled near a loading dock. The private transport service I retained operated with absolute discretion. The rear door swung open. I abandoned the hollow prop suitcase beside a commercial dumpster, slid onto the plush leather seating, and instructed the driver to proceed to the secure penthouse. The transition from the chaotic, public street to the silent, climate-controlled interior of the vehicle mirrored my psychological shift. The theatrical performance concluded. The operative assumed control. The transport navigated the subterranean parking garage of my new building. I cleared the biometric security checkpoints, rode the private elevator, and stepped into my fortified sanctuary. The space remained completely silent, save for the rhythmic, low-decibel hum of the server towers processing localized data packets. I abandoned my wool coat over the back of a chair. I walked directly to the kitchenette, retrieved a ceramic mug, and poured a scalding measure of black coffee from the carafe. I carried the bitter liquid into my command center. I lowered my body into the ergonomic mesh chair facing the expansive glass desk. I woke the workstation. The massive, curved monitors flooded the dark room with a crisp, high-definition glow. I executed the surveillance initiation script. The screen fractured into a grid of distinct video feeds, capturing every conceivable angle of the weaponized apartment across the city. The top left quadrant displayed the exterior street view. The top right exhibited the building's main lobby. The bottom row featured the internal feeds, the replica living room, the staged kitchen, and the hollowed-out office hosting the decoy server. The smart home automation cycled flawlessly. The artificial sunlight streamed through the open blinds, casting long shadows across the fake polyurethane sofa. The space looked inviting, affluent, and entirely defenseless. I checked the digital clock occupying the corner of my right monitor. My supposed flight possessed a scheduled departure time of 9 o'clock in the morning. I rested my hands on the glass desk. I watched the seconds tick upward. I tracked the imaginary airplane lifting off the runway, banking east, and accelerating over the ocean. I consumed my coffee in slow, measured increments. The caffeine sharpened the edges of my focus. I monitored the feeds, processing the sheer audacity of the impending invasion. They did not target a stranger. They targeted their own blood. They planned to leverage my accomplishments to mask their severe financial incompetence. 40 minutes elapsed past the scheduled takeoff time. A sharp digital chime broke the silence in the penthouse. A proximity alert flashed neon red across the top left quadrant of the surveillance grid. The motion tracking algorithm identified a designated target vehicle entering the perimeter. I leaned forward, my eyes locking onto the street-level feed. Vernon's leased luxury sports utility vehicle pulled aggressively against the curb, parking in a restricted commercial loading zone directly outside my old building. The engine cut off. The driver's side door swung open. Vernon stepped out onto the pavement. He wore a tailored sports coat and polished loafers, projecting the aesthetic of a man commanding an empire. Loretta emerged from the passenger side, adjusting the collar of a beige trench coat, carrying an oversized designer tote bag undoubtedly empty and prepared to haul away my reserve wine. Wyatt exited the rear doors, clutching a sleek leather laptop satchel against his chest. The satchel held the silver flash drive. The satchel held the key to his federal prosecution. I tracked their movements as they approached the revolving glass doors of the building. I shifted my focus to the lobby camera, the weekend concierge, a young man occupied with sorting a stack of morning deliveries, stood behind the marble desk. Vernon did not hesitate. He did not lower his head or attempt to avoid detection. He marched through the lobby with a breathtaking, unearned arrogance. He offered the concierge a sharp, dismissive wave, acting with the absolute entitlement of a primary tenant. The concierge nodded politely, assuming Vernon possessed legitimate authorization. The trio bypassed the front desk and entered the elevator bank. I toggled the feed, pulling up the 7th floor corridor camera. The elevator doors parted. Vernon led the formation. He marched down the carpeted hallway, stopping directly in front of my mahogany door. He reached into the inner pocket of his sports coat and retrieved the brass emergency key. He did not hesitate. He did not glance over his shoulder to check for witnesses. He slid the jagged metal into the cylinder. The high-definition microphone embedded in the hallway fixture captured the heavy, metallic click of the tumblers aligning. Vernon gripped the brass handle and pushed the heavy door inward. The invasion officially commenced. The prey crossed the threshold. The steel cage awaited. Saturday evening descended over the city, casting long, jagged shadows across the skyline. Inside my secure penthouse, the environment remained pitch black, illuminated solely by the cascading video feeds glowing across my massive monitors. The previous 30 hours provided an agonizing display of territorial desecration. I watched Vernon and Loretta systematically erase my existence from the old apartment. They removed my abstract artwork, replacing the canvases with framed collegiate press clippings highlighting Wyatt's minor, fabricated achievements. They shoved my personal artifacts into heavy plastic bins, hiding them deep within the bedroom closets. They set a stage. Now, the actors arrived. At precisely 7 o'clock, the heavy mahogany door swung inward. Wyatt swaggered across the threshold. He wore a bespoke charcoal suit, the fabric draping flawlessly over his shoulders. The garment projected absolute corporate dominance, financed entirely by the embezzled capital he siphoned through his Delaware shell corporations. He commanded the room, leading a syndicate of 12 venture capitalists into the faux luxury living room. These men did not wear the casual fleece vests typical of standard angel investors. They wore aggressive, tailored pinstripes. They moved with the synchronized, predatory efficiency of a wolf pack entering unfamiliar territory. They scanned the crown molding, evaluated the square footage, and assessed the physical assets. Wyatt desperately needed their capital to cover his impending margin call. He owed millions. These men possessed the liquidity required to keep him out of a federal penitentiary. Loretta emerged from the kitchen, embracing the role of the affluent, aristocratic hostess. She wore an expensive cocktail dress, her posture rigidly upright. She carried a silver tray supporting a dozen crystal goblets. She bypassed the cheap liquor they brought themselves, opting instead to uncork 3 bottles of my reserve Cabernet Sauvignon. The vintage required 5 years of meticulous sourcing to acquire. She poured the dark, heavy liquid without spilling a single drop. She glided between the intimidating investors, offering the goblets with a practiced, predatory charm. She gestured toward the floor-to-ceiling windows, sweeping her hand across the illuminated city skyline. She sold the illusion of absolute dominance, pointing out landmarks as if the family owned the concrete beneath them. Vernon anchored the opposite side of the room. He positioned himself directly in front of the replica polyurethane fireplace. He held a thick tumbler of amber bourbon, swirling the ice against the glass. He corralled 3 of the most imposing investors into a tight circle. He puffed his chest, his baritone voice booming across the hidden microphones concealed within the air vents. "My son operates on a different frequency," Vernon declared, taking a slow sip of the stolen liquor. "We recognized his genius intellect before he could even walk. He conceptualizes market structures ordinary men cannot comprehend." The lead investor, a broad-shouldered man bearing a severe expression, raised an eyebrow. "Genius requires capital to scale. Your son claims your family backstops his operations." Vernon let out a deep, booming laugh, a masterful deployment of psychological misdirection. "We possess a massive real estate portfolio. We own commercial towers and residential blocks spanning the eastern seaboard. We provide the foundational rock. Wyatt provides the vertical acceleration. The capital is endless." Vernon constructed a fortress of lies, brick by verbal brick. The investors nodded, their eyes calculating the immense net worth required to maintain such a sprawling, fictional estate. They swallowed the deception. In the center of the living room, Wyatt took control of the narrative. He leaned casually against the back of the cheap, replica leather sofa, swirling the wine in his goblet. He engaged the lead venture capitalist, projecting an aura of bored, effortless wealth. "This space is remarkable," the lead investor noted, tapping a knuckle against the hollow particle board of the dining table. "Prime location, unobstructed views, the overhead must be staggering." Wyatt smiled. He lied with terrifying, sociopathic ease. "I purchased this loft outright with the exit liquidity from my first platform build," he stated, his voice smooth and entirely devoid of hesitation. "A man requires a quiet sanctuary to compile code. It serves its purpose." The venture capitalists exchanged approving glances. In their ruthless industry, physical luxury equaled fiscal stability. They interpreted the panoramic views and the expensive wine as undeniable proof of Wyatt's past success. They believed the illusion. The dramatic irony saturated the air, thick and suffocating. I sat motionless in my ergonomic chair. I watched the high-definition cameras capture every lie, every boast, and every sip of stolen wine. The microphones transmitted the sharp clinking of crystal goblets directly into my noise-canceling headphones. They toasted to their imminent success. They celebrated a massive, impending victory inside a room actively recording their every breath. They stood inside a wiretapped cage, congratulating themselves on the architecture of their own prison. I tracked their movements across the infrared overlay. I monitored their heat signatures. Wyatt played the perfect host. But beneath the bespoke tailoring, a frantic desperation leaked through his micro-expressions. His jaw clenched whenever an investor looked too closely at a fixture. His eyes darted toward the hallway. He possessed less than 72 hours before his brokerage liquidated his remaining assets. He needed the syndicate to wire the funds by Monday morning. He needed to close the trap. Loretta intercepted an investor wandering dangerously close to the smart home thermostat. She diverted him with a fresh pour of wine and a fabricated story about imported Italian marble. Vernon continued to occupy the vanguard, absorbing questions about liquidity and deflecting them with grandiose tales of imaginary corporate acquisitions. The family operated as a synchronized, criminal unit. They utilized my achievements as a flesh suit, parading around my territory, entirely ignorant of the crosshairs resting squarely on their foreheads. The pleasantries reached their natural conclusion. The atmosphere shifted from social networking to ruthless business. The lead investor set his empty goblet down on the coffee table. He checked his heavy steel wristwatch. "The wine is exceptional, Wyatt," the lead investor stated, cutting through the ambient chatter. "The real estate is impressive, but we do not write checks for skyline views. You promised a live demonstration of the neural aggregation protocol. We want to see the architecture. We want to see the numbers." The room fell completely silent. The remaining investors turned their attention to Wyatt, their expressions hardening into masks of pure, analytical calculation. The social facade dissolved. The predators demanded the meat. Wyatt nodded, his smile tightening just a fraction of an inch. He placed his glass on a side table and adjusted the cuffs of his tailored shirt. He projected unshakable confidence. But the hidden microphones picked up the slight, erratic hitch in his breathing. "Gentlemen," Wyatt announced, gesturing toward the hallway leading to the home office. "Allow me to show you the engine. Step into the workspace. The algorithm speaks for itself." He turned and led the pack of suited men down the corridor. Loretta and Vernon remained in the living room, exchanging a quick, triumphant glance. They believed the deception succeeded. They believed the finish line sat mere inches away. I shifted my posture in the dark penthouse. I placed my fingers lightly over the mechanical keys of my workstation. I watched the video feed transition as Wyatt ushered the investors into the office. The 12 venture capitalists crowded around the perimeter, their eyes locking onto the massive steel chassis of the decoy server resting in the center of the room. The setup projected undeniable, heavy-duty processing power. Wyatt walked to the head of the desk. He placed his hands flat on the glass surface, assuming the posture of a visionary tech founder preparing to unveil a revolution. "The cloud synergies operate in real time," Wyatt lied, his voice echoing off the walls. "What you are about to see is not a simulation, it is live data aggregation, processing millions of variables per second." The lead investor crossed his arms, his gaze fixed on the blank monitors. "Show us." I stared at my screens. The tension coiled tight in my chest. The entire operation, the weeks of planning, the silent relocation, the meticulous coding of the federal malware, all converged on this singular, microscopic window of time. Wyatt reached into the inner pocket of his bespoke jacket. He retrieved a sleek, silver flash drive. I tracked the silver metal as it caught the light of the room. That tiny device held the offshore routing numbers. It held the fake shell company registries. It held the undeniable proof of his massive embezzlement scheme. He held his own execution order between his index finger and thumb. I did not blink. I kept my hand hovering over the keyboard, absolutely still. Waiting for the precise moment, arrogance overtook logic, and the steel jaws of the trap finally snapped shut. I watched the 12 venture capitalists tighten their perimeter around the glass desk. The ambient light of the room reflected off their tailored lapels and polished Oxfords. Wyatt stood at the epicenter. He held the silver flash drive between his thumb and index finger. He rotated the small piece of metal, letting the overhead halogen bulbs catch its surface. The device looked insignificant. It weighed mere ounces. Yet, it contained the entire architecture of his fraud. It held the Delaware Shell Company registries, the Cayman Islands routing nodes, and the digital ledgers tracking $4 million of stolen venture capital. He stepped toward the massive steel chassis of the decoy server. He did not hesitate. He did not question the origin of the hardware or verify the network integrity. Arrogance blinded his operational security. He believed he commandeered my digital fortress. He assumed my infrastructure now served his empire. Wyatt aligned the silver drive with the universal serial bus port located on the front panel of the server tower. He pushed his arm forward. Metal scraped against metal. The connectors engaged with a sharp, definitive click. I depressed the enter key on my mechanical keyboard. The switch bottomed out with a heavy thud. My command center violently transformed. The stark black screens of my dual monitors instantly flooded with cascading rivers of neon green text. The federal tracking malware, dormant within the decoy server's root directory for days, woke up. It detected the foreign hardware. The script bypassed the primary operating system, burrowing directly into the architecture of the silver flash drive. Wyatt applied zero-day countermeasures. He protected his stolen millions with a commercially available, 4-digit passcode protocol. My malware sliced through the fragile encryption in less than 3 seconds. The terminal on my left monitor confirmed the breach. Root access granted. The extraction initiated. I watched the progress bars materialize across my screen. The decoy server deployed a vacuum protocol, ruthlessly scraping every single byte of data housed on the flash drive. The malware did not distinguish between personal files and financial ledgers. It pulled the raw code, aggregated the packets, and funneled them straight into the secured holding directory on the decoy machine. Inside the old apartment, the physical monitors resting on the glass desk flickered. A fabricated, highly polished graphical user interface loaded across the screens. Wyatt programmed a visual distraction. A massive, sleek progress circle appeared in the center of the display, spinning slowly. Fictitious status updates flashed beneath the circle, initializing neural network, aggregating market synergies, deploying cloud protocols. Wyatt turned his back to the hardware. He faced the syndicate of venture capitalists. He spread his arms, projecting the unearned confidence of a visionary founder. The algorithm requires a moment to cache the global datasets. Wyatt lied, his voice steady, his posture relaxed. We are compiling millions of variables in real time. Once the initialization concludes, the interface will generate the predictive models. The lead investor checked his heavy steel wristwatch, his expression unyielding. He nodded once, crossing his arms over his chest. He accepted the delay. He watched the spinning circle, entirely oblivious to the catastrophic data hemorrhage occurring just inches away. Behind the fake loading screen, the true digital violence escalated. My right monitor tracked the outbound transmission. Capturing the evidence constituted merely the first objective. I did not intend to stockpile his financial crimes. I intended to weaponize them. The malware packaged the stolen ledgers, the offshore routing hashes, and the Shell Company incorporation documents into a highly compressed, heavily encrypted digital envelope. The script attached the apartment's media access control address and the active Internet Protocol signature to the payload. It created a definitive, undeniable geographic anchor, tethering the criminal data directly to the physical location where Wyatt currently stood. The script engaged the external routing protocol. It bypassed commercial internet service providers, tunneling through a secure, anonymized proxy network. The destination address did not belong to a private investigator or a local police precinct. I routed the payload directly to the automated threat reporting portal maintained by the Federal Bureau of Investigation Cybercrimes Division. I programmed the outgoing ping to emulate a Level 1 corporate intrusion alert. Federal cyber analysts utilize automated sorting algorithms to filter the millions of tips they receive daily. A standard report regarding financial fraud might languish in a digital queue for months. A Level 1 alert bypassing the public portal and striking the internal servers directly triggers immediate, unignorable alarms. The terminal screen confirmed the outgoing handshake. The federal servers accepted the connection. I watched the upload speeds peak. The green progress bar filled the window, surging toward 100%. The transmission thrust the raw, undeniable proof of a $4 million international embezzlement scheme directly into the lap of federal law enforcement. The data packets slammed into the government mainframes. The automated federal algorithms instantly unpacked the payload. They scanned the contents. They identified the blacklisted offshore routing numbers. They recognized the active corporate theft. Miles away, inside a secure federal facility, proximity alarms undoubtedly blared. Red warning banners flooded the monitors of cyber analysts working the night shift. The system registered a massive, active data breach involving a live corporate embezzlement node. The geography tethered the crime to a luxury apartment in the financial district. The metadata confirmed the illicit transfer of stolen venture capital. The federal apparatus mobilized. They did not require a subpoena to investigate an active, ongoing cyber attack broadcasting a Level 1 alert. The digital tripwire severed. The avalanche commenced. I shifted my focus back to the live video feed broadcasting from the hidden air vent camera. Wyatt continued his sales pitch. He paced the floor in front of the glass desk, his bespoke charcoal suit absorbing the ambient light. He gestured animatedly, deploying hollow corporate buzzwords to mesmerize his audience. The scalability of this architecture represents the true value proposition, Wyatt declared. Establishing eye contact with the lead investor, we bypass traditional data bottlenecks. We offer absolute, uninterrupted liquidity. The framework sustains infinite growth without compromising security. He gestured toward the fake loading screen. The spinning circle reached 90%. He smiled. He believed he stood on the precipice of a monumental victory. He believed the syndicate prepared to wire additional millions into his fraudulent accounts. He possessed absolutely no comprehension of his actual reality. He did not know the silver flash drive resting in the port now sat completely empty, scrubbed clean by the aggressive malware. He did not know his offshore ledgers currently populated the active case files of federal agents. He assumed his fake demonstration captivated the room. He had just handed the federal government the entire, unredacted roadmap of his criminal enterprise. He delivered his own execution order, stamped it with his digital signature, and wrapped it in a bow. Loretta appeared in the doorway of the office. She held an empty crystal wine goblet. She surveyed the room, her chest puffing with unearned maternal pride. She watched her son command a room full of powerful men, operating under the delusion that her gaslighting and theft paved the road to a generational dynasty. Vernon remained in the living room, his booming laugh echoing down the hallway, celebrating a victory that actively mutated into a federal indictment. The spinning circle on Wyatt's monitor hit 100%. The fake progress bar vanished. A fabricated, highly stylized dashboard exploded across the screens, displaying meaningless, fluctuating line graphs and shifting pie charts. "Gentlemen," Wyatt announced, turning his back to the monitors and spreading his hands, "the future of predictive analytics is currently live." The investors leaned forward. They scrutinized the flashing graphs. They murmured among themselves, calculating the potential returns. They swallowed the poison, entirely convinced by the elaborate presentation. I sat in the dark, silent penthouse. I leaned back into the mesh of my ergonomic chair. The digital snare tightened, the loops closing securely around Wyatt's wrists, his ankles, and his throat. The federal machinery currently gridded the city, dispatching tactical units to the geographic coordinates I provided. The digital phase concluded. The physical consequence approached. I rested my index finger lightly against the heavy plastic of the spacebar. The execution demanded a transition. They celebrated the illusion. I needed to lock them inside the reality. I pressed my thumb against the heavy plastic of the spacebar. The mechanical switch bottomed out with a solid, definitive click. The encrypted command bypassed the public internet, routing directly into the spliced microcontroller hidden within the wall panel of my former home. Inside the office, Wyatt opened his mouth to deliver the next fabricated talking point. He never pushed the syllables past his teeth. The automated smart home protocols executed the emergency lockdown sequence instantly. A violent, mechanical grinding noise erupted from the ceiling cavities. The heavy, reinforced steel storm shutters deployed. They slammed downward over the expansive floor-to-ceiling windows with a concussive, deafening crash. The metal barricades severed the ambient city light, plunging the entire apartment into absolute darkness for a fraction of a second. The localized emergency generators engaged. Dim, crimson emergency lighting flared along the baseboards, casting long, harsh, demonic shadows across the walls. Simultaneous with the deployment of the shutters, the electronic deadbolts fired. The heavy steel cylinders slammed into the reinforced door frames at the front and rear exits with sharp, concussive cracks. The synchronized mechanisms sounded identical to a firing squad chambering rounds. The overhead speakers, previously broadcasting low-volume, atmospheric jazz, cut out abruptly. The sudden, suffocating silence lasted only a millisecond before human reaction shattered it. The 12 venture capitalists operated on primal instinct. The sudden sensory deprivation and violent mechanical deployment triggered immediate threat responses. The lead investor flinched, his hand jerking upward. The crystal goblet slipped from his grip, shattering against the hardwood floor. The vintage reserve wine splattered across his polished Oxfords, pooling like blood under the crimson emergency lights. The other men backed away from the center of the room, their predatory swagger evaporating. They pressed their backs against the drywall, scanning the perimeter, identifying the corrugated steel shutters blockading the skyline. They recognized the architecture of a trap. Wyatt staggered. The sudden blackout disrupted his equilibrium. He gripped the edge of the glass desk, his knuckles turning stark white. He looked at the window, then at the door. Failing to comprehend the architectural metamorphosis, he assumed a systemic malfunction. "Stay calm," Wyatt ordered, his voice cracking, entirely devoid of its previous corporate authority. "It constitutes a minor electrical fault. The building runs regular grid diagnostics. I will override the mainframe." He lunged toward the decoy server terminal. He grabbed the optical mouse, frantically clicking the buttons. He struck the enter key, desperately attempting to clear the screen and restore his fabricated dashboard. He needed the illusion to hold. My malware responded to his physical inputs. The fake graphical user interface dissolved into a sea of static. A single, solid block of neon red flooded the dual monitors. A high contrast, black text warning banner materialized across the center of the displays. The government seal of the Federal Bureau of Investigation Cybercrimes Division anchored the left corner. The text broadcast a severe, unmistakable message. Critical infrastructure. Breach detected. Illicit data exfiltration logged. Federal authorities dispatched. Remain in place. Wyatt stared at the glowing red pixels. The crimson light washed over his pale face. The color drained entirely from his cheeks. His jaw dropped. The illusion of the genius tech founder disintegrated. He read the federal warning, his eyes darting back and forth across the block letters. He realized the silver flash drive he plugged into the port did not demonstrate his brilliance. It delivered his unredacted criminal ledgers directly to the government. In the living room, Vernon dropped his tumbler of bourbon. The heavy glass bounced against the Persian rug, spilling the amber liquid into the expensive fibers. He bypassed the confused investors. He charged down the hallway, rushing toward the mahogany front door. He gripped the brass handle and ripped it backward. The mechanism refused to yield. The heavy steel deadbolts held the solid wood firmly inside the reinforced frame. Vernon grunted, planting his leather loafers against the floorboards. He yanked the handle with his entire body weight, the tendons in his neck bulging against his collar. The door remained absolute. an immovable slab of timber and steel. He slammed his shoulder against the wood, striking the barrier repeatedly. The impact produced dull, heavy thuds, but the perimeter held. He possessed no leverage against military-grade containment protocols. Loretta abandoned the silver serving tray on the hollow particle-board kitchen island. The affluent hostess facade collapsed, exposing the panicked, fragile grifter hiding beneath the cocktail dress. She sprinted down the corridor, her heels clicking frantically against the hardwood. She witnessed Vernon battering his shoulder against the locked door, rubbing his collarbone in pain. She spun around, her eyes wide, staring into the dim illumination of the home office. "Wyatt!" Loretta shrieked. The sound pierced the tense atmosphere, high-pitched and hysterical. "Fix the security system, disengage the locks, let us out of here." Wyatt did not respond to his mother's screams. He stood paralyzed behind the glass desk, staring at the flashing federal warning banner. The investors closed in around him. The lead venture capitalist grabbed Wyatt by the lapels of his bespoke charcoal suit, twisting the expensive fabric into a tight knot. The investor shoved Wyatt backward against the edge of the desk, pointing a thick, aggressive finger at the glowing red monitors. "What did you do?" The investor snarled, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "You routed our capital through a flagged node? You brought us into a federal sting," Wyatt stammered, raising his hands in a pathetic gesture of surrender. "No, no. I swear this is my sister's hardware. She set the network architecture. I do not know what that screen means." The lie offered zero salvation. The investors recognized the mechanics of a collapsing Ponzi scheme. They realized Wyatt paraded them directly into an active crime scene. They dropped him, stepping away as if his bespoke suit carried a lethal contagion. They pulled their encrypted smartphones from their pockets, rapidly dialing their respective legal counsels, demanding immediate extraction. I watched the chaos unfold across the grid of my high-definition surveillance feeds. The living room camera captured Vernon pacing frantically. He pulled his mobile device from his sports coat, dialing the emergency dispatcher, only to discover the cellular signal jammers I installed inside the drywall severed all outbound communication. The screen displayed 0 bars. He threw the device against the replica sofa in a fit of impotent rage. The office camera captured Wyatt clutching his chest. He hyperventilated as the flashing red warning banner illuminated his mounting terror. He reached for the silver flash drive, attempting to yank it from the universal serial bus port. The automated locking mechanism inside the chassis clamped down on the metal, securing the drive permanently. The hardware refused to release the evidence. The kitchen camera caught Loretta weeping. She gripped the edge of the faux marble island, her manicured nails digging into the cheap laminate. She looked at the heavy steel storm shutters barricading the windows, realizing her audience of elite financiers now viewed her as a common, trapped rat. They paced the perimeter of the apartment like feral animals confined to a terrarium. They shook the door handles. They pounded their fists against the corrugated steel storm shutters. They screamed at each other, the toxic family dynamic cannibalizing itself under the crushing pressure of the lockdown. Vernon blamed Wyatt for the faulty equipment. Loretta blamed Vernon for utilizing the emergency key. Wyatt blamed me for configuring a hostile network. The arrogance, the boasting, the theft, the gaslighting, the entire foundation of their sociopathy shattered against the impenetrable reality of the cage. They stripped away my sanctuary, assuming they could claim the territory without consequence. I replaced the territory with a vacuum, sealing them inside to face the vacuum's collapse. They stood inside a concrete and steel vault, bathed in crimson emergency lighting, entirely stripped of their leverage. I leaned back in my ergonomic chair. I steepled my fingers, resting my chin against my knuckles. I did not celebrate. I simply watched the monitors, ensuring the physical containment held steady. The trap secured the prey. Panic replaced their swagger. The executioners were already en route. The lockdown sustained a rigid perimeter for precisely 14 minutes. I utilized the duration to observe the collapse of their psychological infrastructure. Inside the sealed apartment, the oxygen seemed to thin. The crimson emergency lighting bathed the occupants in a harsh, unforgiving glow, stripping away their tailored disguises. The 12 venture capitalists retreated to the farthest edges of the living room, pressing their backs against the cold drywall. They recognized the radioactive nature of the environment. They segregated themselves from my family, forming a distinct boundary. They checked their useless, jammed cellular devices, their expressions hardening into masks of pure self-preservation. They calculated their legal exposure, preparing to jettison Wyatt the second authorities arrived. Vernon abandoned his assault on the unyielding front door. He paced the length of the Persian rug, his chest heaving. Sweat stained the collar of his expensive Oxford shirt. He dragged his hands through his thinning hair, muttering fragmented, incoherent strategies. The booming, confident patriarch disintegrated, replaced by a cornered animal realizing the trap possessed no exit. Loretta stood paralyzed near the hollow particle board kitchen island. She gripped the edge of the laminate counter, her knuckles stark white. She abandoned her crystal goblet. Instead, she grabbed the open bottle of my reserve Cabernet Sauvignon, lifting the glass neck directly to her lips. She swallowed the vintage wine in desperate, unrefined gulps, the dark liquid spilling down her chin and staining the bodice of her cocktail dress. Inside the office, Wyatt continued his futile war against the decoy server. He hammered the mechanical keyboard. He gripped the silver flash drive, yanking the metal casing with violent, jerky motions. The automated locking mechanism held firm, securing the evidence within the port. The monitor remained locked on the blazing red federal warning banner. The glow illuminated the sheer, unadulterated terror contorting his features. He spun in circles, staring at the ceiling, searching for a non-existent override switch. My attention shifted to the top right quadrant of my surveillance grid. The 7th floor hallway camera captured the arrival. The elevator doors parted. A synchronized column of armed personnel surged into the corridor. The strike force consisted of a specialized Federal Bureau of Investigation Cybercrimes Tactical Unit, flanked by heavily armored local police officers. They moved in a serpentine formation, their footfalls muffled by heavy tactical boots. Matte black Kevlar vests absorbed the hallway lighting, helmets obscured their faces. Short-barreled rifles remained leveled, tracking imaginary targets. They did not pause to announce their presence. They did not knock. Federal warrants involving active corporate embezzlement and data exfiltration authorized dynamic, unannounced entry protocols. 2 massive operators broke off from the vanguard. They carried a heavy, solid steel battering ram. They positioned themselves directly in front of the mahogany door. The lead agent raised a clenched fist, counting down the strike with sharp, physical gestures. 3, 2, 1. The operators swung the ram. The steel cylinder collided with the center of the mahogany door. The kinetic impact generated a concussive shockwave, shaking the plaster dust from the corridor ceiling. The wood splintered, but the reinforced deadbolts I installed absorbed the initial blow. The operators stepped back, reset their footing, and swung the ram a second time. The heavy steel breached the threshold. The brass locks shattered, the internal tumblers shearing apart under the extreme physical force. The door tore free from its metal hinges, crashing inward against the foyer tiles with a deafening, chaotic roar. The tactical team flooded the apartment. They poured through the breached entrance like dark water, fanning out across the foyer and spilling into the living room. Searing white beams from under-barrel flashlights pierced the crimson emergency darkness, strobing across the faces of the trapped occupants. The optical assault blinded the targets, disorienting their equilibrium. Hands in the air, step away from the servers. The lead agent roared. The command reverberated off the walls, raw and absolute, leaving zero room for negotiation. The 12 venture capitalists complied instantly. They dropped to their knees, interlacing their fingers behind their heads, pressing their faces against the hardwood floor. They possessed the situational awareness to neutralize themselves. Removing their bodies from the tactical threat matrix, they offered zero resistance, surrendering their physical autonomy to the federal presence. Vernon froze in the center of the Persian rug. The flashlight beams pinned him in place. A tactical officer lunged forward, grabbing Vernon by the shoulder of his sports coat. The agent swept Vernon's legs out from under him, forcing the older man onto his stomach. Vernon groaned as his chest impacted the floorboards, his arms wrenched violently behind his back. Loretta shrieked. The piercing sound echoed from the kitchen. She dropped the wine bottle. The glass shattered against the tiles, splattering the remaining dark red liquid across the floor. An officer approached her. His weapon lowered but his posture unyielding. He commanded her to turn around. She complied, her entire body shaking, tears carving tracks through her expensive makeup. She pressed her face against the refrigerator door, whimpering as the agent secured her wrists. The primary tactical element bypassed the living room, converging on the home office. They moved with predatory efficiency, establishing a perimeter around the glass desk. The lead agent stepped through the doorway, his rifle aimed squarely at Wyatt's chest. The blinding white flashlight beam struck Wyatt directly in the eyes. Wyatt staggered backward. He collided with the edge of the glass desk, his legs giving way. He raised his hands, palms facing outward, trembling uncontrollably. The blood evacuated his face entirely, leaving his skin a sickly, translucent gray. He looked at the armed federal agents, then at the glowing red monitors, his mind actively fracturing under the weight of his impending incarceration. He calculated his options. He possessed zero leverage. He lacked a plausible defense, facing decades in a federal penitentiary. The arrogant tech founder abandoned all pretense of familial loyalty. He reverted to his baseline cowardice. Wyatt frantically pointed a shaking finger toward the ceiling corner, gesturing wildly at the ventilation grate concealing one of my microscopic cameras. "This isn't my apartment, it's my sister's. She set me up," Wyatt shrieked, his voice cracking into a high-pitched, pathetic wail. The syllables tumbled over each other in a desperate bid to deflect the executioner's blade. "He threw me under the treads of the federal machine without a second of hesitation. The hardware belongs to her. She configured the network. Check the lease. I am a victim." The tactical agents ignored his pathetic excuses. Federal cyber analysts track data, not verbal deflections. The agents recognized the active intrusion alert. They identified the primary suspect standing directly adjacent to the compromised hardware. "Turn around and place your hands on your head," the lead agent commanded, stepping into Wyatt's personal space. Wyatt refused to comply. He kept his hands raised, shaking his head in violent, panicked denial. "You need to listen to me. She trapped us inside. She engineered this entire demonstration." The agent did not repeat the instruction. He holstered his primary weapon, reached forward, and grasped Wyatt by the lapels of his bespoke charcoal suit. He spun Wyatt around with ruthless, physical force, slamming him face first against the surface of the glass desk. The impact rattled the decoy server tower. "Do not resist," the agent stated, his tone devoid of emotion. The officer pinned Wyatt's shoulder against the glass, pulling his arms backward. He produced a pair of heavy steel handcuffs. The ratcheting mechanism clicked with a sharp, metallic finality as the cuffs locked around Wyatt's wrists. The cold steel bit into his skin, permanently tethering the failed entrepreneur to the reality of his crimes. A secondary agent approached the server tower. He produced a pair of anti-static gloves, slipping them over his hands. He examined the universal serial bus port. He gripped the silver flash drive, pressing the manual release latch on the internal locking mechanism. The hardware clicked, disengaging its grip. The agent pulled the drive free, sealing the device inside an anti-static evidence bag. He secured the physical manifestation of the $4 million embezzlement scheme. In the living room, additional officers mirrored the procedure. The sharp clicks of heavy steel handcuffs echoed across the apartment. They pulled Vernon to his feet. His tailored sports coat hung awkwardly over his restrained arms. He stared at the floor, his jaw clenched tight, entirely stripped of his patriarchal authority. They escorted Loretta away from the kitchen counter. Her cocktail dress bore the dark stains of spilled wine. She sobbed openly, mascara running down her cheeks in jagged, dark streaks. She looked toward the office, seeking salvation from her golden child. But Wyatt remained pinned against the glass desk, his face pressed against the cold surface, weeping in absolute defeat. The venture capitalists remained immobilized on the floor, their hands interlaced behind their heads. The federal agents ignored them, focusing exclusively on the primary targets identified by the cyber intrusion alert. The tactical team established total control of the environment. The operation concluded with devastating, flawless precision. I sat in my secure penthouse, watching the high-definition feeds. I tracked the agents as they marched my brother, my father, and my mother out of the home office, through the chaotic living room, and past the shattered mahogany door. The flashlights cut through the darkness, illuminating their handcuffed wrists and lowered heads. I did not smile. I did not celebrate. I simply documented the extraction. I watched the architects of my lifelong misery vanish into the illuminated seventh-floor corridor, heavily guarded by federal agents, marching directly toward the consequences of their own arrogance. The physical breach completed the trap. The legal execution awaited. The physical breach concluded the field operation, but the psychological dissection required a different theater. I remained seated in my ergonomic chair. I closed the local surveillance feeds, minimizing the grid displaying my ruined, empty apartment. I opened a secure, encrypted portal utilizing a heavily vetted virtual private network. Gideon, my corporate attorney, possessed extensive contacts within the municipal and federal judicial systems. He utilized his credentials to requisition the live, closed-circuit video and audio feeds, broadcasting directly from the downtown precinct holding facility. The monitors shifted from the crimson emergency lighting of my former living room to the stark, unforgiving fluorescent glare of police interrogation rooms. The brutalist architecture of the precinct offered zero comfort. Cinderblock walls painted a sterile, institutional gray absorbed the light. Heavy steel rings bolted to scratched stainless steel tables served as physical anchor points for the accused. I focused my attention on the primary feed displaying Interview Room A. Vernon and Loretta occupied the space. The local detectives removed their heavy steel handcuffs, but the physical liberty offered no relief from their psychological containment. The precinct reduced their affluent suburban camouflage to rags. Loretta shivered, wrapping her arms tightly around her torso. The ambient temperature of the concrete room stripped away her body heat. Her cocktail dress, stained dark with my reserve Cabernet Sauvignon, clung to her frame. She stared at the two local detectives sitting across the table, her jaw set in a rigid line of absolute, staggering delusion. Vernon leaned forward, placing his palms flat on the scratched metal surface. He attempted to project his usual booming authority, but the harsh lighting exposed the deep, exhausted lines carving through his face. "This constitutes a massive, bureaucratic misunderstanding," Vernon declared. He struck his index finger against the table. "You arrested the wrong individuals. My son operates a multi-million-dollar technology firm. We utilize this property to secure additional capital. We possess authorization." The lead detective, a man bearing the weary posture of someone who spent 2 decades processing grifters, leaned back in his metal folding chair. He reviewed a standard incident report secured to a clipboard. "The property management confirms the lease belongs exclusively to your daughter," the detective stated, his tone flat. "The security mainframe logged an unauthorized, forced entry. The federal cyber unit initiated the raid based on an active data exfiltration alert originating from the hardware you attempted to commandeer. That constitutes felony trespassing, breaking and entering, and conspiracy." Loretta slammed her hand against the table, the sharp slap echoing through my headset. "My daughter is currently flying to London," Loretta shrieked, her voice echoing off the cinder blocks. "She attends a cybersecurity conference. She permitted our entry. The moment her flight lands, I will contact her. She will contact your superiors, terminate this ridiculous investigation, and drop all charges immediately. You are harassing a respectable family." The detective raised an eyebrow, noting her erratic behavior. "Ma'am, the federal government does not drop active embezzlement and cybercrime charges because a relative requests a favor. You do not understand our dynamic." Vernon interrupted, crossing his arms. He lifted his chin, clinging to his patriarchal illusion. We operate as a cohesive unit. We pool our assets. Family protects family. Jade will apologize to us for failing to disable her perimeter alarms. Now, supply me with a telephone. I shifted my gaze to the secondary monitor. Interview Room B housed a significantly different atmosphere. Local detectives did not process Wyatt. 2 federal agents from the Cybercrimes Division occupied the space. They did not sit, they stood over him, weaponizing their physical presence. Wyatt sat slouched in the metal chair, his wrists secured to the steel ring anchored in the center of the table. His bespoke charcoal suit absorbed the sweat pouring from his pores. The fabric wrinkled, clinging to his trembling shoulders. The arrogant, visionary tech founder completely evaporated. A terrified, cornered fraudster remained. The lead federal agent tossed a translucent anti-static evidence bag onto the metal table. The plastic landed with a soft crinkle. Inside, the silver flash drive rested against the bottom seam. "We extracted the raw data packets," the federal agent stated. He did not yell. He utilized a low, clinical volume that amplified the threat. "We identified the routing nodes. We matched the venture capital deposits to 3 distinct Delaware shell entities. We traced the outbound wire transfers directly to the Cayman Islands. We possess the ledgers detailing $4 million in stolen capital." Wyatt stared at the silver drive. His breathing escalated into rapid, shallow gasps. His chest heaved. He licked his dry lips, his eyes darting toward the two-way mirror, searching for an escape route that did not exist. He desperately attempted to resurrect his corporate armor. He straightened his spine, lifting his chin in a pathetic display of defiance. "I demand legal counsel," Wyatt stammered, his voice cracking on the final syllable. He swallowed hard, trying to project a veneer of legal savvy. "I refuse to answer any inquiries without my attorney present. You confiscated private, proprietary algorithms. You breached my intellectual property. My legal team will litigate this entire raid into the ground. They will dismantle your evidence." The second federal agent chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. He leaned over the table, placing his face inches from Wyatt's sweating forehead. "You do not possess a legal team," the agent whispered. "You possess a public defender. We froze the Delaware accounts 30 minutes ago. We initiated asset forfeiture protocols on your luxury leases. You possess zero liquidity. You routed millions of dollars of investor capital into offshore black holes. You did not write algorithms. You operated a Ponzi scheme, and you brought it directly onto a federally monitored network." Wyatt recoiled, pressing his back against the metal chair. The reality of his absolute financial annihilation severed his vocal cords. He opened his mouth, but no sound emerged. He stared at the anti-static bag, realizing the silver drive did not merely hold his crimes. It served as his permanent anchor to a federal penitentiary. I routed my attention back to Interview Room A. The local detective reached into his suit jacket. He extracted a department-issued mobile device and slid it across the scratched metal table toward Vernon. "You possess authorization for a single outgoing transmission," the detective stated, stepping back and crossing his arms. "Utilize it efficiently." Vernon grabbed the device. He did not hesitate. He did not dial a defense attorney. He did not dial a bail bondsman. His profound entitlement blinded his logic. He genuinely believed he retained absolute authority over my resources. He believed my bank accounts, my legal connections, and my compliance remained fully accessible, waiting to extract him from the concrete cell. He punched the digits of my personal cellular number into the keypad. He pressed the device against his ear. His jaw clenched, waiting for the international routing protocols to connect. Inside my silent, fortified penthouse, the screen of my encrypted smartphone illuminated. The device rested flat on the glass surface of my desk. The screen displayed a generic, municipal caller identification. I did not reach for the phone. I leaned back in my ergonomic chair. I steepled my fingers, resting my chin against my knuckles. On the monitor, Vernon tapped his fingers impatiently against the metal table. He expected the line to ring. Connect. and immediately yield my panicked, subservient voice. He expected me to grovel, to accept responsibility for the automated federal response, and to instantly deploy Gideon to secure his release. The device on my desk vibrated, emitting a low, sustained hum against the glass. I watched Vernon's expression through the surveillance feed. The initial seconds of his call ticked past. His impatient tapping slowed. The rigid, authoritative line of his jaw began to slacken. The call transitioned from the primary ring cycle to the automated voicemail system. "She remains in transit," Loretta offered, her voice shaking as she clung to her fabricated timeline. "She crosses the Atlantic. The signal fails over the ocean." Vernon ignored her. He pulled the device away from his ear, staring at the blank screen as the call terminated. The electronic tone signaling the disconnected line echoed faintly through the precinct microphone. He dialed the sequence a second time. He pressed the speaker to his ear, leaning forward, desperation finally piercing his patriarchal armor. The smartphone on my desk vibrated again. The low hum filled the quiet command center. I watched his chest heave. I observed the realization slowly crawling across his exhausted features. He remembered the shattered deadbolt. He remembered the hollow, polyurethane replica furniture. He remembered the bizarre absence of my authentic artifacts. The mathematical equation finally connected inside his brain. I did not travel to London. I did not sit on a commercial airliner. I orchestrated the entire environment. Vernon lowered the phone. He placed the device onto the metal table. His hand trembled. He looked at the two-way mirror, his eyes wide, staring blindly into the surveillance lens. He finally understood the magnitude of his error. He recognized he did not break into a family sanctuary. He walked willingly into a slaughterhouse. I let the phone ring into the cold, silent void. I severed the connection, entirely comfortable watching them drown. The sun breached the city skyline on Sunday morning, casting stark, geometric rays across the glass desk of my penthouse. My encrypted smartphone vibrated against the surface. 11 missed connections from the Municipal Detention Center logged on the screen. I ignored the glowing device. I stood and retrieved my armor. I donned a tailored, charcoal gray suit. The sharp lines of the blazer and the immaculate press of the trousers projected absolute, lethal authority. I secured my hair into a rigid knot at the base of my neck, stripping away any softening features. I checked my reflection in the mirror. I did not see a daughter or a sister. I saw an executioner. I descended to the subterranean garage. Gideon waited beside his idling town car. At 50 years old, my corporate attorney possessed the unyielding posture of a man who dismantled Fortune 500 companies before his morning coffee. He wore a midnight blue suit. He gripped a thick, leather-bound legal dossier in his right hand. Sharp, color-coded tabs protruded from the heavy parchment pages. We exchanged a single, silent nod. I slid into the leather interior. The vehicle transported us toward the downtown precinct. We pushed through the heavy glass doors of the station. The sterile scent of industrial floor wax and stale coffee permeated the air. The chaotic ambient noise of the precinct hummed around us, ringing telephones, clattering keyboards, and the sharp commands of uniformed officers. We bypassed the crowded public waiting area. The lead detective from the Cyber Task Force met us at the fortified reception desk. He recognized the architect of the federal sting. He bypassed the standard visitor protocols, swiping his access badge against the security scanner. The heavy steel gate rolled back. "They await you in conference room B," the detective stated, gesturing down a long cinder-block corridor. The federal agents concluded their preliminary questioning. They handed them back to us to process the local trespassing charges. I walked down the narrow hallway, my heels striking the linoleum floor with a steady, rhythmic cadence. Gideon matched my pace, the heavy dossier secured beneath his arm. The detective stopped in front of a reinforced steel door. He gripped the handle and pushed the metal inward. The temperature inside the room felt 10 degrees colder. Harsh fluorescent tubes buzzed overhead, casting a sickly, pale illumination over the occupants. Wyatt, Vernon, and Loretta sat on the far side of a long, scratched metal table. The precinct stripped away their affluent camouflage. They wore the identical, wrinkled clothing from the night before. Heavy steel handcuffs bound their wrists to the thick metal rings anchored directly into the table. Their postures sagged. The dark, exhausted circles beneath their eyes betrayed a night spent on concrete benches. A disheveled man in an ill-fitting brown suit sat at the far end of the table. He thumbed nervously through a yellow legal pad. He represented their chief defense lawyer, a low-tier public litigator entirely out of his depth. The heavy steel door clicked shut behind me. Loretta snapped her head upward. Her eyes widened. The crushing tension drained from her face, replaced instantly by a desperate, fabricated salvation. She leaned forward, the metal chains rattling harshly against the steel table. Mascara stained the deep creases beneath her eyes. "Jade!" Loretta cried, her voice cracking, echoing off the concrete walls. She reached her bound hands across the scratched metal, straining against the short chain. "Thank God. Tell them this is a mistake. Tell them we possess authorization. Tell them you invited us." I did not flinch. I did not break my stride. I did not offer a single comforting glance. I walked to the opposite side of the table. I pulled out a metal folding chair. The aluminum legs scraped loudly against the floor. I sat down, aligning my posture perfectly straight. I rested my hands flat on the cold metal surface. Gideon took the seat beside me. He placed the heavy, color-coded dossier onto the table. The sharp thud severed Loretta's ongoing pleas. The chief defense attorney cleared his throat, adjusting his crooked tie. He offered a strained, appeasing smile. "We appreciate you coming down to clear this up. Ms. Jade, my clients experienced a severe misunderstanding regarding the property boundaries. If we can just get the bail paperwork processed and secure your statement withdrawing the complaint." Gideon raised a single hand, stopping the man's sentence mid-syllable. Gideon operated like a surgeon. He did not negotiate, he amputated. "My client is not here to post bail," Gideon stated, his voice cutting like a scalpel through the stale air of the room. "She is here to officially press charges for felony breaking and entering, grand larceny, and unauthorized cyber intrusion." Wyatt's jaw dropped. The breath hitched in his throat, producing a sharp, choking sound. His eyes darted from Gideon to the heavy dossier, then finally locked onto my face. Vernon stared at Gideon, his patriarchal armor cracking into dust. He gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles turning white as he strained against his handcuffs. "You cannot do this," Vernon bellowed, attempting to summon his booming authority. "We are your blood. You left the lights on. You left the property abandoned. We protected your assets." I ignored Vernon entirely. I reached for the thick dossier. I flipped the heavy leather cover open. I extracted the first stack of documents from the red-tabbed section. "You claimed a misunderstanding," I stated, my voice echoing flat and cold across the cinder blocks. I slid 8x10 glossy photographs across the metal surface. The high-definition images, pulled directly from my concealed hallway cameras, captured the invasion in flawless detail. The first photograph showcased Vernon driving the steel crowbar into the mahogany door, his face contorted in exertion. The second image captured Loretta stepping over the ruined threshold, her hands already reaching for my reserve wine. The evidence eliminated any argument of accidental entry or benign intent. Loretta stared at the photographs, her mouth opened, but her vocal cords failed to produce a defense. I extracted the next file from the blue-tabbed section. "You claimed authorization to enter my residence," I continued, pushing a thick stack of legal paperwork across the table toward their defense attorney. The lawyer picked up the pages, his eyes scanning the dense legal text. His complexion paled as he read the contractual parameters. "Those are the certified lease transfer documents," I announced, locking eyes with Vernon. "I vacated that premises 3 weeks ago. I removed my authentic assets. I surrendered the primary lease to a commercial holding company I control. You did not enter my home. You breached a vacant, federally monitored commercial property. You possess zero legal standing to claim familial access to a corporate space. The defense attorney dropped the paperwork onto the table. He pinched the bridge of his nose. He realized he sat next to three indefensible felons. He possessed zero leverage to litigate a defense. The paper trail proved absolute. I turned my attention to Wyatt. The failed tech entrepreneur slouched in his metal chair, his bespoke charcoal suit hanging off his trembling frame. Sweat beaded on his forehead, catching the harsh fluorescent light. I pulled the final stack of paper from the black-tabbed section. The pages contained dense blocks of cascading green text printed against a black background. The digital logs. You required a stage to secure your fraudulent venture capital, I told Wyatt, sliding the network intrusion diagnostics across the scratched metal. You needed my infrastructure to validate your imaginary algorithms. You broke into a secured location and plugged your hardware into a decoy server. Wyatt stared at the raw code printed on the pages. He recognized the formatting. He recognized his own media access control address printed at the top of the log. These logs trace your silver drive bypassing the firewall, I explained, driving the final nail into his coffin. They document your automated data exfiltration. The decoy server stripped your drive. It captured your Delaware Shell Company registrations. It mapped your Cayman Islands routing nodes. It downloaded the master ledgers proving you embezzled $4 million from your previous investors. Wyatt began to hyperventilate. His chest heaved in rapid, shallow jerks. He shook his head in violent, frantic denial, his handcuffs clanking against the table ring. "No," he gasped, fighting for oxygen. "You violated my privacy. That data is inadmissible. I will suppress the evidence." "You cannot suppress evidence you voluntarily uploaded to a federal portal," Gideon interjected, leaning forward. "The decoy server transmitted a Level 1 cyber intrusion alert the second your drive interfaced with the port. You delivered your offshore ledgers directly to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The agents who interrogated you an hour ago already secured the warrants to freeze your domestic accounts." The absolute finality of their destruction crashed over the table. The silence in the room grew heavy, suffocating, and permanent. Wyatt slumped forward. He rested his forehead against the cold metal table, a low, agonizing groan escaping his lips. He realized his startup, his luxury cars, and his freedom evaporated in the span of a single keystroke. He faced a 15-year sentence in a federal penitentiary, and he provided the government the exact roadmap required to convict him. Vernon stared at the glossy breaking and entering photographs. The patriarchal boaster realized he possessed absolutely no defense. His arrogance led him to shatter a deadbolt on camera, securing a felony conviction that would strip away his suburban home and plunge him into inescapable debt. Loretta shrank back against her metal chair. She wept violently, her shoulders shaking with heavy, ragged sobs. She finally understood that her gaslighting held zero power in a court of law. She could not manipulate a digital log. She could not guilt-trip a federal agent. I looked at the three of them. Chained to the wreckage of their own sociopathy, they sought to hijack my life to fund their delusions. They walked blindly into a steel cage and locked the door from the inside. I stood up. I buttoned the center button of my tailored blazer. I turned my back on the scratching chains and the weeping pleas. Gideon gathered the heavy dossier, sliding the documents back into the leather binding. We walked toward the heavy steel door. I did not look back. I stepped out of the interrogation room, leaving them to drown in the concrete cell they built for themselves. My hand gripped the heavy steel handle of the interrogation room door. The cold metal leached the warmth from my palm. The mechanical latch clicked, ready to disengage and grant my exit into the bustling precinct corridor. I paused. The physical extraction felt premature. The digital snare successfully captured the prey, and the preliminary evidence effectively stripped their defenses. But the psychological execution demanded one final, definitive stroke. I released the handle. I turned my body back toward the center of the concrete room. Gideon recognized the shift in my posture immediately. My corporate attorney anticipated the final protocol. He stepped away from the exit, returned to the scratched metal table, and placed the heavy leather dossier back onto the surface. He unclasped the binding and flipped to the final, sealed section marked with a stark black tab. I walked back across the linoleum floor. I pulled out the aluminum folding chair. The metal legs scraped harshly against the concrete. I sat down, aligning my spine perfectly straight, projecting an aura of unyielding, absolute control. The absolute finality of their destruction crashed over them like a collapsing structural beam. They watched my return, with wide, bloodshot eyes, their brief spark of fabricated relief extinguishing instantly. I leaned forward, resting my forearms against the table. "You thought I was losing my grip," I said. I modulated my voice, lowering the pitch to an eerily calm, resonant register. I threw the exact insults they hurled at me weeks ago in their suburban kitchen right back into their faces. "You thought I was just a solitary corporate drone. You claimed I possessed no vision. You assumed I swept up digital bugs for the real players. You forgot that I hunt financial criminals for a living." I reached into the open dossier. I extracted a thick stack of documents bearing the official seal of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I slid the paperwork across the table, halting the pages directly beneath Wyatt's trembling gaze. "I revealed the preliminary intrusion logs," I stated, tapping my index finger against the top sheet. "Now, I will reveal the full extent of the evidence. I confirmed this morning that the Federal Cyber Unit successfully bypassed your pathetic commercial encryption. They possess the unredacted contents of your silver flash drive. They hold the exact routing hashes detailing the $4 million you stole from your previous investors." Gideon stepped forward, drawing a secondary file from the black-tabbed section. He dropped the stapled packets onto the table with a heavy thud. "Furthermore," Gideon announced, his voice vibrating with absolute legal authority, "the venture capitalists you paraded into my client's apartment did not simply walk away. They retained aggressive corporate litigators immediately following the raid. They filed massive civil lawsuits against you an hour ago in the municipal court. They seek absolute liquidation of your remaining assets, the immediate seizure of your offshore accounts, and punitive damages for gross misrepresentation." Wyatt began to hyperventilate. The oxygen evacuated his lungs in rapid, ragged wheezes. He gripped the roots of his hair with both hands, pulling violently. The heavy steel handcuffs clanked harshly against the metal table ring. His arrogant, visionary facade suffered utter, irrevocable annihilation. Gideon did not relent. He outlined the specific statutes. He detailed the federal charges for wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and unauthorized data exfiltration. Wyatt stared at the reality of a 15-year federal prison sentence. He faced decades in a maximum security penitentiary, combined with an insurmountable civil debt that would permanently garnish any hypothetical future earnings. The illusion of the prodigy tech founder shattered into worthless, microscopic fragments on the precinct floor. He transformed into a broken, terrified fraudster, suffocating under the weight of his own hubris. I shifted my gaze to my father. Vernon stared blankly at the high-definition breaking and entering photographs still scattered across the metal surface. His jaw hung slack. His chest caved inward, deflating his patriarchal posture. He searched the glossy images for a loophole, a technicality, an excuse to deploy his booming authority. He found nothing but his own face, contorted in exertion, driving a steel crowbar into a locked mahogany door. He realized he possessed absolutely no defense. His extreme entitlement engineered a felony conviction. Gideon outlined the collateral damage. Vernon faced the immediate foreclosure of his heavily mortgaged suburban home to cover his impending legal defense fees. The bank would seize his leased luxury vehicles. His country club associates would sever all contact upon reading the public indictment. The patriarch lost his castle, his freedom, and his fabricated legacy in a single, catastrophic night. Loretta wept violently, heavy. Ragged sobs wrecked her torso, shaking her frail frame against the metal chair. Dark streaks of mascara stained her cheeks, cutting through her expensive foundation. She looked at me, her mouth trembling, attempting to form a plea based on maternal bonds. She desperately wanted to invoke the history of my childhood to secure her release. She found my expression entirely devoid of mercy. She closed her mouth. She finally understood that her gaslighting held zero power in a court of law. Emotional manipulation cannot alter a digital server log, tears cannot dissolve a federal indictment. The psychological tools she utilized her entire life to control her environment proved completely useless against the crushing, objective weight of the justice system. She sat trapped in a concrete box, stripped of her manipulation tactics, facing years of incarceration for conspiring to steal her own daughter's life. I observed the three of them. I documented the raw, unfiltered consequences of their sociopathy. They sought to hijack my existence, treating my sanctuary as a temporary stage for their fraudulent play. They treated my accomplishments as communal property, ready to be harvested the second their golden child required a bailout. They walked willingly into the steel cage, plugged the execution device directly into the federal port, and locked the door from the inside. The scales achieved perfect, unshakable balance. I stood up. I buttoned the center button of my tailored charcoal blazer, the fabric pulling crisp and sharp across my torso. I turned my back on the scratching chains, the hyperventilating gasps, and the desperate, weeping pleas. Gideon gathered the heavy dossier, sliding the catastrophic documents back into the leather binding. We walked toward the heavy steel door. I gripped the handle, engaged the latch, and pushed the solid metal outward. I stepped into the bright, bustling corridor of the precinct. I did not look back. I left them entirely abandoned, chained to the wreckage of their own arrogance, drowning in the concrete cell they built for themselves. 8 months evaporated, yielding to the spring of 2011. The federal justice system operates with a slow, grinding, mechanical inevitability, crushing those caught between its gears. Wyatt experienced this crushing weight firsthand. A federal judge evaluated his flight risk, noted the offshore Cayman routing nodes, and explicitly denied him bail. He traded his tailored, bespoke charcoal suits for a coarse, oversized, standard-issue khaki jumpsuit. He sat inside a cramped holding cell within a high-security federal penitentiary, awaiting his official trial. The grand delusions of cloud synergies and neural algorithms dissolved into the bleak reality of concrete walls and steel bars. The venture capitalists he attempted to defraud unleashed their corporate litigators, systematically dismantling his remaining shell companies and freezing every cent of his stolen capital. He faced an unavoidable 15-year sentence for wire fraud and international embezzlement. Entirely isolated from the luxury he believed he deserved, the arrogant prodigy vanished, leaving behind a ruined inmate stripped of his fake empire. Vernon and Loretta anticipated salvation. They sat in their holding cells that first weekend, entirely convinced I would eventually answer their calls, write a massive check, and secure their release. I let the phone ring into the void. Without my corporate income to subsidize their defense, the brutal reality of the legal system consumed them. Criminal defense attorneys demand exorbitant, upfront retainers to navigate federal conspiracy charges, to avoid federal prison time for their active participation in the break-in. They surrendered to severe felony trespassing convictions. The conviction served as the final strike against their crumbling facade. The bank initiated immediate foreclosure proceedings on their sprawling suburban colonial. The county sheriff arrived to enforce the eviction notice. Vernon and Loretta dragged their remaining possessions to the curb in black plastic garbage bags. The bank seized the leased luxury sports utility vehicle. Their country club associates severed all communication, treating their scandal like a lethal contagion, stripped of their home, their credit, and their unearned pride. They retreated to a dilapidated, cramped apartment on the industrial outskirts of the city. Water stains mapped the low, sagging ceilings. The radiators clanked harshly through the night, providing inadequate heat. The affluent neighborhood they spent decades cultivating vanished, replaced by wailing sirens and chain-link fences. They sacrificed their oldest daughter to purchase a crown for their golden child, and the transaction left them entirely destitute. They traded their arrogant suburban comfort for a permanent, inescapable poverty. I sat on the expansive terrace of my secure penthouse, leaning back into a plush lounge chair. The crisp night wind swept across the balcony, carrying the electric energy of the metropolis below. I held a crystal glass of reserve wine, watching the city skyline glitter against the dark horizon. Behind me, the biometric locks secured the perimeter. My custom server racks hummed a quiet, steady rhythm, guarding my digital fortress. The suffocating, heavy weight of their endless entitlement, the constant manipulation, and the forced financial obligations evaporated completely. The air in my lungs felt incredibly light. For years, I walked on eggshells, muting my intellect and hiding my success to avoid triggering their parasitic greed. I abandoned that compliance. I built an impenetrable fortress, and I finally inhabited it in absolute, unbothered peace. The battlefield lay quiet. The story of this ultimate triumph highlights an incredibly profound truth: sharing a bloodline does not grant anyone a free pass to trample your boundaries, exploit your resources, or abuse your trust. Society constantly conditions us to endure silent misery in the name of family loyalty. We receive relentless instructions to shrink our aspirations, to suppress our voices, and to sacrifice our hard-earned stability merely to appease the greed and arrogance of relatives who fundamentally refuse to respect us. Manipulators weaponize shared history, utilizing guilt as a crowbar to pry open our defenses and siphon our energy. However, enduring abuse is not a virtue. Absorbing toxicity does not forge strength, it merely enables predators to continue feeding. When you finally stop accepting the false narrative that you owe toxic relatives your peace, you initiate a monumental psychological shift. You reclaim your true power. You realize that authentic love requires mutual respect, not unilateral subjugation. True security and self-worth do not materialize through appeasement. They are constructed the exact moment you decisively stand up, push your chair back, and walk away from tables where respect is no longer being served. You hold the pen to your own life, and you possess the absolute authority to edit the destructive characters out of your chapters. Your sanctuary belongs to you, and you hold zero obligation to grant access to those who arrive bearing crowbars instead of apologies. Have you ever had to establish an unbreakable boundary to protect yourself from entitled family members who viewed your success as their personal property? Please share your experiences and your strategies for claiming your independence in the comments below. Your story possesses the power to inspire someone currently fighting to build their own perimeter. Don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe for more stories of justice and empowerment. Thank you so much for watching, and goodbye.